You can imagine a mom who discovers that her 16-year-old daughter, Susie, is addicted to heroin. And when she discovers this, she rushes up to her room in disbelief and anger and fear, and they have a conversation where she says, "Susie, how could you do this? You know better than this. I didn't raise you like this. And now I find you've been doing this behind my back. You've been lying about it. You've been stealing from me. You got to stop this right now or it's going to ruin your life." And Susie, in defensiveness and fear and shame, responds to her mom and says, "Yeah, Mom, I know. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. My boyfriend got me into it. I knew it was wrong, but I need to stop. I'm going to stop today. I'm done, and I'm going to pay you back all the money. I'm so sorry." That would not be an uncommon conversation. But what if we could bring Susie's brain to the microphone and have the brain talk to us a little bit? We may hear a different perspective of the story. The brain may say something like this: "I'm Susie's brain. What you don't know about my relationship to heroin is that it really is centered around the idea of dopamine. If you back up and recognize when Susie's dad left, she was craving attention and starving for affection. And so when her boyfriend started giving it to her, she was all in and hooked, and she didn't want to reject the drugs because she was afraid he would leave her. And so she got into that and she knew it was wrong. But let me tell you what happened in me the first time she did it. First time she snorted heroin. My job is to regulate all the signals that I get from Susie's body to make decisions and then to send back signals as to what she needs to do about it. My job is to keep her alive and safe and happy if possible." That's what the brain does. And so when I regulate her dopamine levels, it's usually between 50 and 80. The neurotransmitter, 50 and 80 nanograms per deciliter. On a normal day, she wakes up and has about 50, and that's enough energy and motivation to get out of bed. On the best day of her life, she has 100. That's the level that I'm releasing into her body, and she feels great. On her lowest day, it's maybe 40. So I operate in this level, and this keeps her alive and happy. The first time she snorted heroin, it triggered 1,000. The level was 10 times higher than the best day of her life. We were soaring on cloud 9. And after that eventually wore off, and she got back down to normal, and there was hurt and pain again, I was pretty quick to remember where that really good soaring came from, so I sent her back to here, back to the heroin. Whether it seems rational or not, it got her out of bed and gave her all kinds of motivation and all kinds of good feelings that life was kind of bombarding out of her. But the next time it was only 800, and then the next time it was 600, and then the next time it was 500, and then 300, and then 250, and then 100, and then 80. And the rest of the activities of her life that usually gave her a sense of joy and meaning and pleasure and fulfillment started to just fade to gray. She didn't get any sense of enjoyment from those things anymore. And I'm thinking now survival, just to get her to a normal functioning level, we've got to find the drug. We've got to get back to that dopamine release because nothing else is doing it. So I'm sending her back there until the point eventually she reached where she just had to get there to go through a normal day to survive. So you want to know what my relationship is with heroin? Looks like this. Scientists have taken brains while they're still inside the bodies of people who are addicted to drugs, and they've hooked their brains up to functional MRIs and compared them to other studies. One of the contrasts was a person who was not addicted to substances but had been fasting from water for 3 days. They had gone 3 days without drinking anything. And in the functional MRI, as they put the person through the test, they talked to them about water. They played sounds of water. They put a little water on their tongue, and they watched how the brain responded, how the regions that were relating to survivability, dopamine release, and pleasure lit up. And they did light up, as you can imagine. Somebody had been without water for 3 days, and they lit up to the relative size of a baseball. Then they took somebody who was addicted to drugs and had been clean for a year and asked them simply to describe the first time they did their drug, and their brain exploded, not to the size of a baseball, but to the relative size of a baseball field. This is not simply a bad habit that you can say, stop it, Susie. We are talking about addiction, which brings us to the foundational truth we've been building on this whole series. We cannot save ourselves from our addictions. By definition, if it was something we could just get out of and pull ourselves up, we'd call it a struggle or a bad habit. But when we're talking about addiction, it's imperative to deal with reality. We try, and we are not able to self-rescue, which does not lead us to despair. It leads us actually to a point of hope. The second truth, Jesus can heal us and free us from addictions, and oftentimes he uses others in the process. We've been working with a model called 7 Layers of Freedom. And building upon it, I want to recap a little bit for those who are missing a week or two. The top layer is the layer of behavior. And this is the one that we often start with and try to manage. When somebody's in addictions, they're showing addictive behavior. And this is like the weeds at the surface of our life's garden. And our approach is so often knee-jerk. Let's get rid of the weeds, change the behavior, stop the drinking, stop the heroin, change your spending habits, stop overeating and then purging. And the problem is, if it's truly an addiction, this managed level is really one of the last and most surface levels of true freedom. At the bottom level, the foundational level, is really a question of control. Who's in charge of your life? When we stop and ask ourselves that question, who's in charge? Often the answer is, I am. Who's in control? And it's perhaps the last control that a person who's struggling with addiction feels that they have. At least I have the control to hold on to the control. If nothing else is in control, my life is in chaos, at least I can still maintain the freedom to be in charge of my chaos. And when we come to a point of control and realize the remedy here is surrendering. This is the embedded, built-in foundation of the 12-step programs, recognizing when we surrender and say, Jesus, you're in control. I want to participate and I want to work hard and follow you, but I can't do this on my own. That's the foundational step that begins to unlock freedom. Second layer is wound. Courtney, the lady who runs the JCAP program in the jail, recently told me that of all the people she works with to help them get free from addictions, 100% of them have had a traumatic childhood abusive experience. Somebody has wounded them deeply, and that we don't know exactly the correspondence and connection between those wounds and addictions, but there is a high one. And it's oftentimes buried so far underneath the addictive behavior that we don't address it. And we've often buried it in our psyche or buried it in our past memories. But when we really want to get freedom from the lower layers, we've got to come back to this and we've got to apply the remedy, which is forgiveness. It's a potent, God-given medicine for the deep hurts of our lives. Guys, I think sometimes we talk about forgiveness very familiar and trite ways. But it's when we look at the person who has hurt us, whether it's in real life or whether it's in just our mind's eye, and we say, man, this person has hurt me. And instead of trying to get revenge, instead of letting you keep hurting me by what you did in the past and letting it eat away at me, instead of trying to figure out how to self-medicate and just stop the pain, I am going to address this situation with the power of Jesus. I'm going to forgive you. I forgive you. Doesn't make what you did right. Just means I'm not holding it anymore. And you have no hold on me over it. The next level is sin. These two levels really kind of go hand in hand because wound is admitting honestly that someone else hurt us badly. Sin is admitting where we've gone wrong. And oftentimes we'll want to just do this one. And anytime we're confronted with the wrong that we've done, we'll be quick to say, yeah, but you don't know what somebody else did. Hold on, there's got to be a point where we say, wait, this is my culpability. I did this, and there's no excuse for it. Yeah, somebody else did this to me, but if I constantly self-justify, I'm getting nowhere in terms of my own freedom. Sin is where we come before God and say, I can't get out of this. I can't excuse it away. And what other people did to me is no longer a shield for the wrong that I am doing because it just grows. Please forgive me, God. And the forgiveness is applied that direction. When that happens, friends, spiritual things unlock. It's hard to describe, but when you see it happening, sometimes tears unlock, sometimes emotions unlock, but spiritual things unlock that bring freedom in our lives when we sincerely forgive and when Jesus sincerely forgives us. There's really no other deep way of dealing with the guilt and the shame that we have buried other than this remedy that Jesus has modeled. Here are the two for today. There's one more that we won't touch on today, but this level is hold and disease. This is also a duo. They need to be held in tandem because what often happens is one group or one person or one party in dealing with addiction will deal with only this one or only this one, and they'll want to blind themselves to the other one. Hold is the spiritual stronghold. Disease, let me ask you this, is alcoholism a disease? That's kind of a good question to start an argument. Actually, in some circles, you ask that question, and some people go, of course it is. And other people go, yeah, but no, it's not. It's not like other diseases. You can't call it a disease. You did it. You choose to do this every time. I don't choose to get cancer or some other disease. And actually, there's some tension in that question when it comes to substance abuse. And oftentimes what people don't want to do, and the reason they don't want to call it a disease, is because they feel like it just eliminates all of this stuff. And sometimes when people talk about substance abuse as a disease, they only address this layer and do this and blind themselves to the other one. But let's just be clear about that layer. It's a disease. Substance abuse has medically diagnosable, identifiable effects on the body, causes from the body, physiological, traceable, scientifically repeatable experiments on what is happening in your body and in your mental health. Disease is a real part of this, and what do you do when you have a disease? You search for treatment. It's interesting, the negative reactions that sometimes Christians have about treatment for disease in relation to substance abuse. It's actually a wonderful thing. It's part of the process. It's also interesting to see how often we look to treatment as the only salvation. If we could just get them to detox clinic, if we could just get them to the Celebrate Recovery group or the medication wean down, as if that's the only layer. But if we're looking at this as God's involved in every layer, disease is an important one to hit. That's why we've had Kevin Haynes from A Bridge to Hope and his resources back there every week. He's the first call in terms of finding the resources for disease and treatment. Today I want to look more deeply at hold at that level, and to do that I want to look at Mark 5 with you. It's part of the passage that Dana read, but let's go a little bit deeper with it. Mark 5 starts out, "So they arrived at the other side of the lake in the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus climbed out of the boat, a man possessed by an evil spirit came out from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the burial caves and could no longer be restrained, even with a chain. Whenever he was put into chains and shackles, as he often was, he snapped the chains from his wrist and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Day and night he wandered among the burial caves in the hills, howling and cutting himself with sharp stones. When Jesus was still some distance away, the man saw him, ran to meet him, and bowed low before him. With a shriek, he screamed, 'Why are you interfering with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In the name of God, I beg you, don't torture me.' For Jesus had already said to the spirit, 'Come out of this man, you evil spirit.' Then Jesus demanded, 'What is your name?' He replied, 'My name is Legion, because there are many of us inside him.' Then the evil spirits begged him again not to send them to some distant place. There happened to be a large herd of pigs feeding on the hillside nearby. 'Send us into the pigs,' the spirit begged. 'Let us enter them.' So Jesus gave them permission. The evil spirits came out of the man and entered the pigs, and the entire herd of pigs, about 2,000 of them, plunged down the steep hillside into the lake and drowned into the water. I want to tell you what Jesus said in Mark chapter 4 right before we get to this story. I think it may give some encouragement and hope to some who have been struggling or maybe have a loved one who's been struggling. He told 3 stories. They were all about seeds, but they all had different points. The first one was called the story of the sower, or sometimes called the parable of the 4 soils. And the point is, the farmer sowed seed everywhere, but only one of the 4 kinds of soils actually took and grew to maturity and reproduced and did what the farmer wanted it to do. The point of that story is, you and I are responsible for sharing and speaking words of hope and showing grace and sowing God's love everywhere, regardless of what someone has done, but we are not responsible for the heart condition of the recipient. But yet we still sow broadly. The second story he told was the story of the growing seed. A farmer plants a seed, he goes away, and day and night, whether or not he's tending the seed, it's growing. And it's sort of a mystery to the farmer. He doesn't know how the seed is growing, and yet it grows and it brings a harvest in due time. The point of this story is God's word and God's power will not be stopped, will not be thwarted. There is nothing you or I can do that's going to stop this harvest from coming. The world is not unrecoverable. People are not lost. It may be a mystery how God is working and how we don't even get to be involved in the process at times. But the work of God is growing even when we can't see it. The third story is called the story of the mustard seed. People in Jesus' day used the word mustard seed kind of like we would metaphorically use the word pinhead, not calling a person a pinhead. But like a really small, it's like as small as the head of a pin. And they would say, as small as a mustard seed, it means it was the tiniest thing. And Jesus said, if you plant a mustard seed into the ground, it will grow into this tremendous bush that's almost the size of a tree. And it'll give shade and it'll give home for birds. And his point in saying this story was, even if you don't feel like a spiritual giant, and you don't think you're a saint, you don't have to have a ton of faith. Just have a little bit. And give it to God and watch it grow. After he told those stories, he got in a boat, he calmed a storm, he arrives at the other end of the lake. And if we're interpreting this right, it's probably at night, dark. And you can imagine him getting out of the boat. And here on the right, there's this graveyard area. Graveyards at night. But to make it worse, they hear this howling. And a man comes out, and you can see as the light starts to hit him, scars all over his body where he's been cutting himself. He's ragged. He's got these chains that drag behind him that he's broken in the past. And the moon just glares in his eyes, and you can see the crazy shining back at you. And you can imagine the disciples going, Jesus, wrong place. We misnavigated. Get back in the boat. Let's go 5 miles downshore. This guy is crazy. But instead, Jesus walks to him, and the man runs up to him, and he bows at Jesus' feet. This is so ironic because in the book of Mark, everybody else misses who Jesus really is. Everybody's watching Jesus do these miracles and they're going, wow, this is amazing. Who is this man? Well, what should we think about this person? What is your identity? But oddly enough, here are these demonic spirits who are possessing this man. They know exactly who Jesus is. They see his authority. They know. And he says, what is your name? I am Legion. Legion was a military term for the Romans. It was a unit of about 6,000 soldiers. And if you were not part of the Roman Empire originally, Legion was not a fun word for you. If a legion of Roman soldiers was coming through your area, hide your wife, store the belongings underground, because a legion of Roman soldiers can take and pillage what they want as they storm through and invade. What a great description of what happened to this man who had been taken over. Yet they know, this legion of spirits, they know who their commander-in-chief is immediately. It's interesting that in the description, Mark tells us this man in this region, living in his community, who was possessed by evil spirits, was out of control. They couldn't figure out what to do with this guy. They tried to change him. They tried to fix him. Then eventually they just got to the point where they just had to restrain him. We don't know what else to do but bind him up, chain him down, lock him away. He's a threat to himself and to everyone else. Isn't this a chilling depiction of addiction? Oh, we started with the conversation. The conversation didn't work. The talks, the nagging didn't work. But then we tried to put some emphasis, and then the prayer didn't seem to work. And then we tried pulling away the credit card and taking away the car keys. And then we had an intervention, and we threatened the job, and we threatened to kick out. And then we had all these conversations. We just couldn't control them. They're out of control. We just had to bind them. We just tried to control them on the outside because nothing would work. And you can't hardly blame them. Well, this man's a threat to himself. And what are we just supposed to do? Let him drive drunk and run into some 17-year-old girl on the way home from prom and kill her? What are we supposed to do? But this man would not be bound. He broke every chain except the hold inside of him, which he couldn't get free from until he met Jesus. After Jesus set him free, he evicted this legion of spirits from this man's life. See, there are times in life where, never mind, I'll say that later, it's too early. But I want to say it later because it's important. Jesus set them free. And an interesting side effect is that the community around this man, the community that had tried to chain him, the community that didn't know what to do with him, that was afraid of him, that had isolated him, that had sent him away, when they saw this man now restored, and they saw him in his right mind, he was sober, he was talking, he was not a threat, and Jesus sent him back into the community, and Jesus had let the demons destroy the pigs, you would think this whole town would wake up the neighbors with bells and throw a party. Wow, we couldn't fix this guy, but look what happened. Jesus came to town. He's better. This is amazing. It's a miracle. No, they didn't throw a party. They told Jesus to leave. It's a good caution for those who have grown up in church and have known only the straight and narrow and who get really uncomfortable when somebody starts talking about taking the person who was always on the outside and on the very windy path and bringing them back into the community, whether they've been changed or not. Status quo was better. Even though the status quo was a mess. It's easier than dealing with this power we don't know what to do with this Jesus who does stuff we can't predict, and sometimes costly for us. Here's a question I want to ask. Is it for real? Are we to read Mark 5 and go, okay, does this mean there are people now who have demonic holds on their life? Are we to read Mark 5 and interpret this to say that there are possibly people in our neighborhood, in our school, in our family, in our church, that, as the text says in one translation, are in the grip of these spirits? One of my favorite commentators on the New Testament is named William Barclay. He's a very popular commentator, and he has a series on the entire New Testament. I like reading what he says about different passages. On this particular passage, he writes, It does not matter whether we believe in demon possession or not. The man in the story believed in it. It is good to know that the Lord can deliver us from imaginary dangers as well as from real ones. In some writing on this, you can watch biblical scholars doing interpretive gymnastics to deal with something that they just find outside of the scope of their belief system, like demonic reality and influence. You can watch interpretations take pretty giant leaps, and sometimes it's actually harder for biblical scholars to get their minds and hands around these kinds of stories than it is for everyday Christians who don't have degrees in this stuff, and even people who are not Christians. 2 out of 3 American Christians believe there are such things as demons and that they have influence in people's lives. If you did a worldwide poll, that number would go up quite a bit. A pastor and author named John Eckert was dealing with this question with his church related to, is this a real thing? Is this for real? And does it affect Christians? How does it affect people's lives? And he writes this, can a Christian have a demon? The major issue I could not reconcile was how Jesus and the Holy Spirit could live inside of someone and they still be in the grip of demons. But then we began to face a real problem. We were being confronted with people who we knew were born-again, Spirit-filled believers. And as we prayed for them, they began to manifest demons. Our experience did not line up with our theology. If you would have asked me 10 years ago, back when I was 27, for those of you who think I'm still 23, thank you. I get that a lot. If you would have asked me as I was finishing up my Master's of Divinity at Princeton to interpret this passage, I probably would have slid you William Barclay and said, here, work on this, and not John Eckert. If you would have asked me, practically speaking, what does this mean? I would have said, practically nothing. Theoretically, maybe. But there's a bunch of preaching classes. I didn't see on the syllabus or on the roster anywhere where there's demon classes. I don't know. Better to be safe than stupid, I guess, and just don't do a whole lot with this topic. But then in ministry experience and dealing with people and watching God work and move, my theology did not fit the experiential reality. It's a wonder it was so narrowed and that had limited the biblical realities for so long. There have been a number of times, not like 2 or 3, but a number of times where in praying with someone, in conversing with someone who wanted to have freedom or dealing with a particular issue, demonic manifestations have happened. And it's not crazy, but it's very real and hard to explain in any other manner. Number of times in talking with people and addressing a demon or a hold or a grip in their life that was spiritual, the person would begin to shake uncontrollably for no other explanation until we told the demonic power to stop, and then it stopped. Or they would begin, one lady got caught up in these horrific visions mid-conversation, and she starts kind of wailing a little bit and screaming and could see these pictures and images and couldn't get out of this vision until, again, the authority that Jesus used to remove these spirits was applied to this lady, and she was free from that. There have been a number of times where people, in addressing the demonic holds in their life, have felt pain, nausea, immediate, sudden, want to throw up, give me the trash can, the room is spinning, my head is aching, I feel like I'm being choked around the neck. And again, it's a wonder this is often just a blind spot for us in the healing process. But I just challenge you to read through the Gospels, as I did, with this curiosity of saying, was this real? Did Jesus do this? And this was probably one of the 3 biggest frequent activities he did in his ministry, was removing and freeing people of their demonic holds. It happened all the time. And it was very normal for him and those who trained in ministry under him to do. There was one time a few months ago, in praying with a lady, she was probably in her 60s. She had been a Christian for decades. She went to a weekly Bible study, and she was struggling with this particular area, and in this particular area, there was a demonic hold. And in talking with her, I just addressed the demon. Again, if this sounds crazy, read through the New Testament. And I addressed the demon, and the lady's voice changed, and her demeanor changed, and her face changed, and the demon took over and began speaking through her, and it started referring to the woman in the third person with animosity toward her, and it started telling what it was trying to do in her life to destroy her life, very similar to Mark 5. And after about 2 minutes of conversation, I just told it to be quiet, and I talked to the woman again, and when I said her name, she responded, and I said, "Do you remember what just happened for the last 2 minutes?" "No." "What's the last thing you heard?" "Well," and she said, "the last thing we said 2 minutes ago before I addressed the demonic spirit." She did not remember, acknowledge, or hear anything that came out of her own mouth for the last 2 minutes. So I had to tell her, okay, well, here's what the Spirit is doing in your life. Do you want to continue allowing it to do that, or would you like to be set free in the power of Jesus? Of course. No, I don't want that. Let's get rid of it. And that woman experienced a great amount of freedom when this layer was addressed. Tim Howard, a Wesleyan pastor who spoke here a couple years ago, shared a story about ministering to a man who was an alcoholic. And in his alcoholism, this was a terrible perpetual addiction for him. And when they addressed at this level the spiritual strongholds, and those were broken, the demonic grip, he became sober and his life really changed. And so he came back a while later and Tim asked him, hey, what's the difference before and after you experienced that freedom? He said, oh, that's easy. Before we did this and before we removed those demonic holds, I couldn't go 5 seconds without thinking and hearing a voice in my head that said, drink, drink, drink. I couldn't get my mind on anything else until I drank, and when I drank, I'd be piled on with guilt and shame, but the cycle would start over again. It was like this incessant voice in my head. After we prayed and after you removed those demonic holds, yeah, temptation comes sometimes, but it's not a level 10 out of 10 like it was then. It's maybe a level 2 or 3. And now, yeah, I'm driving home from work and I'm tempted to turn over and go to the bar. But I just resist the temptation, whereas before I was being grounded and pounded and couldn't get up. Here's the point I almost said earlier. There are some places in our life where we need to simply, the biblical mandate is to stand your ground. Don't give ground to the devil who is trying to push in temptation. You have the ground it's occupied, just stand firm in it. There are other places in life where we don't need to stand our ground, we need to take ground. It is under the possession of the legion. They have marched in, and Jesus, look at the imagery of Jesus coming into a setting of death with this man who has absolutely been written off in despair. He didn't tell him, stand firm. No, he took the ground back that this man had been in captive from. We don't have to. You don't have to acknowledge or address any of these levels. You can do 1 or 2. You can pick your favorite 3. You can avoid any ones that you want. It just may not be in your best interest. Jesus said something a while ago that I think I need to repeat this morning. It was an invitation that I want to make to you. Come, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke, my way upon you, and learn from me. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light. I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. I think there are some here who you are weary of the struggle. Whether you'd call it an addiction or whatever, you know the struggle, you know the place where you seem like you cannot get rid of the chains. And you're tired. The invitation is come to Jesus, the same one who set this man free a long time ago. He's still doing the same work because he loves you. I think some of you in the room are weary because you have been trying to bring control to somebody's life who is out of control. You have been sowing the seed feverishly and passionately, and they're not in control. And that's become a burden on your life. And the invitation is this: come and trade that burden for trust in Jesus. His heart is humble. He is not waiting with a big stick to clobber you or someone else. He wants to set you free.